seeing the Americans bogged down now in the Middle East, for the Ukrainians to see all those Patriot missile fired, against drones in the Gulf, billions of dollars of equipment being fired off. That's not going to come to Ukraine now. And the Ukrainians are already desperately short of air defense missiles. An enormous number have been used in the Gulf. That can only be bad news. It was also very striking, Ayesha, to see that now the Americans have gone to the Ukrainians to ask them for help with anti-drone technology in the Gulf. Having, frankly, belittled the Ukrainians for the last year as no-hopers with no cards, the Americans are finding actually that the Ukrainians are the most capable country anywhere of dealing with massive drone attacks.
Peer-to-peer with Ayesha Hazarika on Times Radio.
Well, it's now time to have a chat with one of the fascinating people who I sit alongside on those famous red benches in the House of Lords. And this week it's a very timely guest. It's Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts. Peter Ricketts is a real expert in geopolitics and diplomacy. He's had a glittering diplomatic career spanning more than 4 decades. During that time, he served as permanent representative to NATO in Brussels and head of the Foreign Office. Under Tony Blair, he took on the role of chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, a position which led to him giving evidence in the Iraq inquiry. And under David Cameron, he became the UK's first ever national security advisor. And in 2016, Peter was elevated to the House of Lords, where he sits as a crossbench peer. Lord Ricketts, Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ayesha. Great to be with you.
Well, it's such an important week, and there's so many things I could ask you about. I just want to start with a story that a lot of people have been talking about this week, and this is the leak from the National Security Council meeting. What are your thoughts on that? Because it's so important for those discussions. There's such important discussions. They don't normally leak. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't know the truth of those leaks, Ayesha, but I'm glad to see the National Security Council is being used for lively discussion and debate about these issues. I mean, we set it up in 2010 with David Cameron because he wanted to involve all the bits of government which have some bearing on national security, from economic to military to foreign policy to home affairs, so that the ministers could get together with advice from their experts, including the intelligence heads, and work out the best policy to pursue. So I've no idea whether the leak's true, but at least it looks as if ministers have been debating hard the very difficult choices that they had to make about whether to get involved with the initial strikes on Iran or not.
And these decisions are always difficult, aren't they? I mean, if you were in the room and if you'd been the advice, what would you be saying to the Prime Minister? What would you have been saying to Keir Starmer? I
think I would have said that the special relationship cannot mean blindly following the Americans into any policy they decide to pursue. I mean, I lived very closely through the Iraq War when Tony Blair did follow George Bush into the attack on Iraq. Nobody now remembers Blair's loyalty to George Bush. What they remember is he came into a war on a, let's say, dodgy legal basis, and that has dogged him for the rest of his career. So these issues are hugely important. I would have said, and I think Keir Starmer takes this view as well, that this was not a legal act to attack Iran when it didn't present an imminent threat, and there was no clear plan as to what the military action would achieve, how they would get out of it, how they would improve the situation on the ground. There are echoes of Iraq there, and I think that advises caution.
And look, there are others that take a slightly different view. I mean, I was in the chamber in the House of Lords this week where there was a short debate on this action so far. And there were a number of peers from across the House who said, actually, they do think that this action that America has taken is legal because of the clear threat that Iran has posed to the region and has posed to Israel. In fact, some quite eminent legal minds stood up and took that view. What do you say to that argument, Peter?
Well, in the end, we'll leave the lawyers to argue about that. I mean, I would just note that there were negotiations going on the eve of the attack, where the Americans and the Iranians were sitting down to try to negotiate some further limits on the Iranian nuclear program. And there was indeed an agreement in place on the Iranian nuclear program, which Donald Trump pulled the Americans out of when he came into power. So it's not impossible to negotiate with the Iranians. Yes, they have behaved disgracefully, including to their own population and their regional troublemaking around the Middle East. But the honest truth is that this air campaign is not going to overturn the regime, in my view. It's not going to help the poor, suffering people of Iran. In fact, many of them have been wounded or killed in these air assaults. So in order to improve Iranian behavior durably, we need to get talking to them again after this traumatic experience they've lived through, and try and get them to see that there are better ways of dealing with the international community, not trying to wreck things in the region, behaving more reasonably towards their own population. And at that point, then sanctions can perhaps be eased and they can get back to some sort of normal life. After every military conflict, there has to be diplomacy, there has to be some post-conflict settlement. And I hope minds are moving in London towards that right now. And
we had a very interesting, illuminating, but a very sobering discussion with Ed Conway, who is the economics and data editor at Sky News at 2:00, where he was talking about the profound economic consequences that this conflict could have, not just on our economy, but world economies. He was saying, he is really himself worried as a real expert on these issues, and he hopes that this is as short-lived a conflict as possible, just for the economic consequences. Do you have any sense of how long this could go on for? Because it feels like Donald Trump has a sort of proclivity for going in hard and fast and then withdrawing, or do you think this could end up being a longer conflict than we want it to be?
Every Iran war game that I've ever been involved with, the scenarios included attacks on the oil installations across the Gulf, closing the Straits of Hormuz. This was entirely predictable and predicted. And yes, you can see the impact straight away on the global economy, with inflation, with energy prices rising quickly. And I think if the Hormuz Straits stay shut much longer, there's going to be really serious impact. So I think the pressures on Trump now are pretty strong from the markets, right, from his MAGA base in the US, who are very uncomfortable with this, from friends and allies in the Gulf, to get this over quickly. And because he hasn't defined any clear political outcome, it's always open to him to declare a historic victory at any point and say that he's sufficiently smashed the Iranian military regime that they can wind down the strikes and that Iran will then be kept under close vigilance. So my instinct, I don't know, but my instinct is there's probably not very much longer to go with this highly intensive air attack. Probably the person with the greatest interest in it continuing actually is Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. He has an election this year, and his interest, I think, is to go into his election saying, I've comprehensively demolished the one remaining major threat to Israel, having dealt with Hamas and Hezbollah. I've now smashed the Iranian military regime. So he may be the one holding out longest for this to continue.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting point you make about the pressure that Trump may well come under from the markets, and that certainly has shaped his thinking in the past. And look, Peter, what did you make of the Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy's comments saying that actually Britain could bomb Iranian missile silos if it was part of defensive action? Do you agree with him?
And that's what the Prime Minister agreed could happen 3 or 4 days ago, that he wasn't going to be part of the initial attack, but where it came to attacking weapons that really did pose an imminent threat to the Gulf countries, for example, rather than waiting for the missiles to arrive, to attack them in place, that was lawful. I think that's a stretch for the British approach to international law, but I think there's a lot of sense in that. It's preemptive, and rather than waiting for more devastation in the Gulf. In practice, Britain's capability to do it is probably quite limited. We don't have many aircraft out there, and I suspect that that's a job essentially for the Americans to do, while we defend the Gulf allies against the attacks from drones and so forth. It is a reminder of how thinly stretched the British armed forces are, that it has proved so difficult even to get one warship into the Middle East area. I think there are real lessons here to speed up defence spending, to try and close some of those gaps, because we have been found that we're very, very short of the key assets you need in a crisis like this, while also defending Ukraine. And let's not forget the poor people of Ukraine.
Absolutely. In fact, quite a few people have messaged in saying that, as well as feeling sorry for the Iranian people, they feel really sorry for the people of Ukraine, because this is a complete distraction. And as we heard from Ed Conway, all of this, particularly with the Strait of Hormuz being bunged up, it's going to give Russia a bit of a bounce as well in terms of oil.
Absolutely. I mean, the oil price going up is a bonanza for Russia. And also seeing the Americans bogged down now in the Middle East, for the Ukrainians to see all those Patriot missiles fired, against drones in the Gulf, billions of dollars of equipment being fired off. That's not going to come to Ukraine now. And the Ukrainians are already desperately short of air defense missiles. An enormous number have been used in the Gulf. That can only be bad news. It was also very striking, Ayesha, to see that now the Americans have gone to the Ukrainians to ask them for help with anti-drone technology in the Gulf. Having frankly belittled the Ukrainians for the last year as no-hopers with no cards, the Americans are finding actually that the Ukrainians are the most capable country anywhere of dealing with massive drone attacks.
And look, this question has come up a lot from our listeners during our conversation, Peter. So I'll just pick up one question. And this is going back to that point I make about international law. Quite a few people said, look, we don't understand. Hasn't Iran been a habitual international lawbreaker? The sponsoring of terrorists, supplying drones to Russia, involvement with October the 7th. We've just had people arrested today. We know that Iran has, been a threat level to us here in the UK for some time as well. Many listeners are saying, how come that does not constitute justification for action by America and Israel? Lots of my listeners are can you just address that question again?
Yes, and it's a perfectly fair question. I mean, the issue is, when is it reasonable for a country or a couple of countries to go to war, to kill the leaders of countries, to bomb the country intensively? What are the criteria where that is reasonable? And we've always said, as the UN Charter says, that there has to be an imminent threat from that country to your national security to justify that. You have to set the bar high. Otherwise, any country that decides that a neighbor or another country is an enemy can go in and attack it, bomb it, kill its leadership. And if we're going to stop Xi Jinping doing that to Taiwan, if we're going to have legitimate criticism of the Russians for the massive assault that they made on Ukraine, we have to set that bar high. And I think my judgment is that, yes, Iran has been a thoroughly malevolent regime for many years. They've been heavily sanctioned, but they have at least also been prepared to negotiate with the West and put into effect agreements with the West.
Have they not just been playing us for time, though, in doing that and going into these negotiations in bad faith to buy time to stock up their nuclear arsenals and missiles and everything else?
Well, the building up missiles, yes, they've certainly been doing that. Many countries around the world do that. Their nuclear program was under very, very tight surveillance under the agreement reached in the Obama period with David Cameron in 2015, the one that Trump pulled the Americans out of. That had the nuclear program very, very carefully watched by the international agency. And I think people felt comfortable that was under control. And the deal was then, if that stayed under control and they stayed well short of the kind of level of enrichment that would give them a nuclear weapon, then progressively sanctions would be lifted and gradually they could be reintegrated into the world economy. The problem with pulling America out of that deal was that they had a free hand to start their race towards nuclear weapons. Trump said he'd bombed them and demolished them completely last June. So I don't see that can really have been the objective of this campaign. So, I mean, my central point, I think, is that you have to be careful about the conditions under which one country goes to war with another. The people who framed the UN Charter in 1945 had lived through 2 world wars. It wasn't a sort of liberal, airy-fairy construct. It was because they knew that if might is right and strong countries attack weaker countries, whenever they judge there might be a threat from them, that way lies disaster for the world. And I think that that's right. So although you have to be very vigilant about countries like Iran, I think there are real dangers in deciding, right, we're now going to go in, assassinate your leadership, bomb you flat, because we judge that you might one day be a real threat to us. And that way is a world of strong men and might is right, which is a bad place for middle-sized countries, smaller countries to be.
Well, look, Peter, what a fascinating conversation. I could speak to you for hours about this, but we will let you go. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ayesha. See you on the red benches.
See you soon. That's Peter Ricketts there, Lord Ricketts.